Despite using his military genius to delay the inevitable outcome, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, was finally ousted from power, in the early months of 1814, by the larger armies of the immense coalition of allied European powers opposing him. The subsequent Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed by Napoleon in mid-April. The terms he had reluctantly agreed to forced him to abdicate the throne of France, and be banished to the small Mediterranean island of Elba, where he would sit as its ruler. After making a stirring farewell speech at Fontainebleau, on April 20, Napoleon began his overland journey to the port of Fréjus, in the south of France, from where he would set sail to Elba. Napoleon's hand-picked Old Guard battalion, which was allowed to accompany him to Elba, was made to take a separate route to the departure port. Napoleon dismissed the Allied leaders' proposal to have one of their own military units escort him along his own route to the port. Instead, Napoleon would make his trip in a small convoy, consisting of just 4 carriages and several household staff members. Also traveling with them were 4 carefully selected Allied commissioners: British Colonel Neil Campbell, Prussian Count Walburg Truchess, Austrian General Franz Koller, Russian General Shukalov, who was given ominous instructions by the Russian Tsar, Alexander. Safeguard the Emperor Napoleon to his destination, as you will answer to me with your head for it. The people in the first towns along the route of the journey greeted Napoleon with cheers of support. The next towns visited were more subdued and quiet. Further on in the south of France, closer to the destination, in a region where loyalties to the royalists were strong, trouble began, as locals openly insulted Napoleon when he passed by them. Then, on April 25, at the village of Organ, in the region of the town of Avignon, Napoleon's small cavalcade was assailed with open hostility by a large crowd. They had even strung up a burning straw effigy of Napoleon. The mob was determined to lynch the former Emperor of France. Unknown to Napoleon and his escort, a secret society of radical royalists, calling themselves the Chevaliers d'Artois, the Knights of the Faith, had been summoned by the royalist leader, Count Artois, to go ahead of Napoleon, along his known route, and conspire to stir up lynch mob activities among local populations, to kill Napoleon before he left France. The crazed lynch mob had overwhelmed Napoleon's tiny escort, and were at the doors of his coach, clawing at its windows and reaching inside. They were only mere moments away from pulling out their intended victim, and tearing him to pieces in the street. As later described by Bourrienne, a secretary of Napoleon. Screaming women converged threateningly on his carriage, calling him the butcher of their husbands and sons, and making ready to tear him to pieces while he cowered in terror. But somehow, the Russian commissioner, whose own life depended upon the safety of Napoleon, frantically pushed back the rabid crowd with his horse and fists. And in that brief pause in the ongoing insanity, he bravely and desperately gave a loud speech of rebuke and condemnation towards the savages before him. Bourrienne writes of the speech shouted out by General Shukalov. "Look at him. You can see that contempt is the only weapon you ought to use on this man." The Russian general succeeded in making them momentarily regain their senses and calmed them down. Napoleon nodded his thanks in relief to the hero of the moment. The risk of the mob ripping apart the Russian, in place of Napoleon, was real but did not happen. Instead, the sordid scene became surreal, when the mollified crowd suddenly began cheering in appreciation to the Russian uniformed general, yelling, "Long live our liberators!" The crowd backed away, giving Napoleon and his convoy enough time to continue on their journey, having barely avoided its sudden violent end. However, the danger was not over. As shook up as Napoleon felt at that moment, there would be an upcoming night, during which he, the former feared master of Europe, would be utterly reduced into a human state of pure petrification.